Even those who do not actively study history have most likely heard of Alexander the Great. One of the greatest conquerors and rulers of the ancient world, Alexander lived a short but very busy life. In 2004, Oliver Stone decided to tackle the life of Alexander and show the world who he was, not just as the famous ruler, but as a man as well. The film, however, was a flop. It got a score of 16% out of 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, and critics hated it. They said that it didn't stand up to the life of Alexander at all, and that Colin Farrell could not handle such a large role. However, as a general overlook of his life, even though it's a campy mess, Alexander provides a good glimpse into the ancient past and the peoples and beliefs contained therein. As long as we remember to take it with a grain of salt, as we must with any future film that looks to tackle history. I chose Alexander after learning a bit more about him, not only in the Race and Ethnicity in the Ancient World book, but also in the Crash Course in History videos that Professor Quinn had us watch in week 1. The idea that one man, especially one so young, would seek out to conquer the world fascinated me, especially one who almost succeeded. Taking that with the ideas we've started learning in this course, including, to borrow a phrase from Dr. Rebecca Fudo Kennedy, the idea of culture diffusion, that is, when a country is conquered, the sharing of both cultures to create something new, is something that has definitely sparked my interest. One of the first scenes that struck me in regard to race and ethnicity is at the beginning of the film. Young Alexander is with a group of boys learning about the cultures near and around Macedon. There is a large mosaic map on the ground, and the teacher, Aristotle, is teaching the boys about different cultures. Alexander speaks up, asking questions about the heroic myths, and is quickly shut down and told that they were just that, myths. This scene and the descriptions of the races around Macedon actually mesh fairly well with what we've been reading in Race and Ethnicity in the classical world. Aristotle is speaking of the barbarian races around Macedon, and one of the little boys quips a question that's very obviously meant as a joke regarding something that the Macedonians did not think of as an acceptable behavior, just as the Greeks and Romans in Race and Ethnicity describe the other races they know of in our textbook. They do this as a way to familiarize the unfamiliar, a term we've heard from several of the academic sources we've looked at so far. What this scene really sets up is what the movie tried and somewhat failed to capture, and that is the interest of Alexander in the world around him, the seeds that were planted for Alexander's drive to conquer the world and spread the way of the Greeks and Macedonians. What Alexander accomplished in his lifetime was to leave behind a legacy the likes of which had never been seen before. After the death of his father, whose wish it was to defeat and conquer the Persians, Alexander managed just that. In an epic battle, he defeated the Persian army and sent their king and his guards on the run. This would set in motion one of the things about Alexander that is truly memorable. Once he made it to Babylon in the movie, at the behest of a princess of Persia, he makes the decision to allow the royal family not only to live as they were, but to somewhat remain in power as long as they pay fealty to Alexander. This was unheard of at the time, and Oliver Stone definitely does a good job of having the actors show surprise and incredulity on their faces. This was not just a part of the film, but something Alexander actually did with the cultures and nations he conquered. Interestingly, the film does a decent job of representing Persia as well as part of India and a little of Asia. However, it completely ignores Egypt, which is the home to one of the biggest Alexandrias that Alexander founded and which stood for many years after his death. A way that Alexander helped spread goodwill with the locals, outside of allowing their rulers to remain rulers under Alexander, was to feast and celebrate with them. And he even decided to take wives with several of the ethnic groups. There's an interesting scene in the film where Alexander's closest men and friends are arguing with him about going back to Macedon and creating an heir for his empire. They were worried about the fact that he did not have a pure Macedonian son to take over in case of his death. The film talks about this concept, that of a pure Macedonian heir, several times among his mother, his men, and even just the narrator. It shows the importance among the lineage of the time, as well as the idea that the Macedonians and Greeks believed that they were so much better than others. It was not race so much as ethnicity and nationhood that they cared about. Eric Gruen addresses the importance of kinship and nationality in his article, Fictitious Kinships. Much of what he discusses, including the use of Perseus in several countries, relates well here in that it was very important to the Macedonians to keep their ruler of pure lineage. I remember at the time that one issue that the film did not shy from, and in fact played up quite a bit, which caused great controversy and some of the dislike of the film, was the acceptance of homosexuality among the Grecians and Macedonians. In a conversation with his mother, Alexander talks about Hephaestion, his lover, and the love of his life. After he's married, his new wife, Roxanne, catches him in a tender goodbye with Hephaestion, which seems to disgust her. Later in the film, when they're having a party in India, Alexander kisses his manservant after his men goad him into doing so. The physical relationship between the two is hinted at throughout the movie before this. The Indians are visibly disgusted, as is his wife. This is actually a decent example of the idea that while the Greeks and Macedonians thought themselves to the greatest society of the time, that some of their practices were considered abhorrent to others. Where they often question the strangeness of the cultures they do not yet know, the tide is turned on them in this aspect. The depictions of India seem fairly apt for the time period. When Alexander and his men go to war with some of the people of India after his men are afraid to go any further on his conquest, one thing that Oliver Stone approaches is the use of war elephants. While the idea of war elephants may seem fantastical, it was a factual thing, even shown in passages later in The Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World book, where it said that the ruler of the time rode elephants over the mountains to attack the peoples of Europe. One thing in particular that the film Alexander is very careful to do, which Dr. Denise McCoskey spoke about in her video about her book Race and Antiquity, is to whitewash the Macedonians. While it's not overtly addressed, every person that's shown in Greece or Macedon is white. Even the servants are white. As we see in Bernardine Evaristo's video, and in the ideas she presents in her book, The Emperor's Babe, people at this time were well-traveled. They had good roads. Diversity would have been a foregone conclusion. However, many academics find that there is not evidence enough to support this idea, and therefore the people of the time are often depicted as white. Oliver Stone did not see the idea of diversity in his vision of the time period. The film ends with the untimely death of Alexander at the age of 32. It does tackle both the conspiracy theory where he was poisoned, as well as the idea that he died of typhoid fever. No one actually knows how he died, only that he died young. His advisor, since he did not name an heir, fought over his kingdom until it was divided among them. The narrator, who it is revealed to be one of those advisors, Ptolemy, is shown in Egypt, the territory he was granted after Alexander's death. Oliver Stone set out with the Herculean task of tackling the life of Alexander the Great. While he did an okay job with the story, he only did a so-so job with showing the race and ethnicity of the time. He wasn't exactly at fault here, since much of the world still believes in the idea that the ancient world was hardly diverse at all, and he's making a film for the greater audience. He did, however, do a fairly decent job of showing the different cultures that Alexander influenced.